The first thing I should tell you is that I killed a man named Darren on the 11th day. Not with my hands, not with a weapon. I killed him by driving away. I heard him shouting my name from the shoulder of Route 35 while I watched him shrink in the side mirror, and I did not stop. He had stepped out to check a noise under the rear axle, and I had seen movement in the tree line. 3 figures, maybe 4, coming through the brush with that terrible loping gait that meant they were fresh, still fast, still coordinated enough to close distance. And I made a calculation that took less than 2 seconds. I could wait for Darren to climb back in. That would cost 4, maybe 5 seconds. In 5 seconds, those figures would reach the road. Or I could drop the clutch and go. I went. Darren had a bad knee from a fall he'd taken outside Zanesville. He couldn't have outrun them even if I'd given him a direction to run toward. I don't know exactly what happened after the bus pulled away. I heard sounds. I didn't look back again after the mirror lost him. That was day 11. I drove for another 231 days before I stopped for good. Everything I'm about to tell you is framed by that choice, and I need you to understand that before I describe anything else. Because the person who lived inside that bus for 8 months was not the person who originally converted it. The person who converted it was careful and optimistic and thought in terms of preparation. The person who drove it after day 11 thought in terms of debt. I should go back. My name is Asa Brandt. I was 36 when the outbreak started, working as a transportation logistics specialist for a private defense contractor based out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky. That's a long way of saying I drove things. Trucks, mostly. Tactical vehicles when the contract required it. Fuel tankers twice, which made me nervous enough to request reassignment. What the job actually taught me was how to think about vehicles the way a doctor thinks about a body. Systems, tolerances, failure points. The difference between what a machine is rated to do and what it can actually do under field conditions. I left that job in March of the year before the outbreak, because the company lost its DoD contract and I didn't want to relocate to their secondary office in Fayetteville. I had savings. I had a 2004 Bluebird All-American school bus I'd bought at a municipal auction for $2,200. And I had a plan that, in retrospect, was one of those plans that sounds reasonable right up until the world decides to test it. The bus conversion had been my project for 14 months before the outbreak. I want to be clear about that because it changes the math. I wasn't a prepper. I wasn't building an apocalypse vehicle. I was building a home. I'd seen people living in converted buses online, and the economics appealed to me. No rent, no mortgage, the ability to move when a place stopped working. I was recently divorced, and the settlement had left me liquid but not wealthy. And the idea of owning a self-contained space that nobody could take from me had a psychological pull I didn't fully understand at the time. I understand it now. The conversion was thorough because that's how I work. I stripped the interior to the steel frame and rebuilt it in sections. The rear third was sleeping quarters. A full-width platform bed with 3 inches of closed-cell foam, storage drawers beneath, a narrow closet on the driver's side for clothes. The middle third was living and working space. A fold-down table that seated 2, a counter with a 2-burner propane stove, a small steel sink plumbed to a 25-gallon freshwater tank mounted beneath the bus. The forward third, behind the driver's seat, was storage. I built wooden racks along both walls and bolted them through the bus frame so they wouldn't shift in transit. Those racks held canned food, tools, spare parts, first aid supplies, propane canisters, and eventually things I'd never planned for. Weapons, barricade materials, a hand crank emergency radio that became the only voice I'd hear for weeks at a stretch. The bus had a diesel engine, a DT-466 International, which was the single most important fact of my survival. Diesel engines are mechanically simpler than gasoline engines. They're more fuel efficient. And diesel fuel, in a world where gasoline was rapidly going bad or being hoarded, turned out to be more consistently available because people panicked toward gas stations and ignored the truck stops, the farm supply depots, the construction sites where 500-gallon tanks sat on stands behind chain-link fences. I carried two 50-gallon auxiliary tanks I'd mounted beneath the chassis, plus whatever was in the main tank. Fully loaded, I had a range of roughly 400 miles. That number governed everything. Every decision I made for 8 months passed through the filter of how many miles it would cost, and whether I could recover those miles somewhere ahead. The first week of the outbreak, I was parked at a campground outside Clarksville, Tennessee. I'd been living in the bus full-time for about 3 months by then, moving between campgrounds and Walmart parking lots, showering at truck stops, working intermittent gig jobs loading freight at a distribution center. The news had been strange for a few days. Something in Virginia, something in Pennsylvania. Contradictory reports about a new pathogen that didn't behave like known pathogens. I remember the specific broadcast that changed my assessment. A woman on NPR, an epidemiologist, was being interviewed, and the host asked her to characterize the transmission pattern. And there was a pause. Maybe 2 seconds, but the kind of 2 seconds where you could hear the person on the other end deciding what they were allowed to say versus what they knew. And she said, "The behavioral presentation is inconsistent with any known prion, viral, or bacterial agent. And I think we need to be honest about that." The host moved on. The epidemiologist was not invited back. But that pause lived in my head, and that night I filled every container I had with water and drove to a truck stop and topped off the diesel. By day 3, Clarksville was unrecognizable. Not destroyed, it was too early for that, but wrong. The base was locked down. The roads leading to it were backed up for miles with dependents trying to get in. The grocery stores had been stripped, and the ones that hadn't were being guarded by employees holding shotguns, which told you everything about how fast the social contract was dissolving. I saw my first infected person on day 3. She was walking along the shoulder of Highway 41A in a hospital gown, and I slowed down because I thought she was a patient who'd wandered away from a facility. Then she turned toward the bus, and I saw her face, and I understood the epidemiologist's pause. Whatever was wrong with this woman was not an illness I had a framework for. I didn't stop. I accelerated, and I began heading north, because north was a way. The first few weeks were defined by one word: corridors. The interstate system was collapsing from the cities outward. I-24 was impassable by day 5. I-65 was a parking lot by day 7. But the secondary roads, the state routes, the county highways, the farm roads that connected small towns to smaller towns, those were still open, because the people in rural areas hadn't panicked the same way yet. Some of them didn't believe it. Some of them were waiting for instructions. Some of them had simply not encountered the infected yet and thought the whole thing was somewhere else. I moved through those corridors like water through cracks, always choosing the road with fewer cars, always keeping the speed between 30 and 40, so I could stop or reverse without losing control of a vehicle that weighed 19,000 pounds. I learned to read road signs differently. A sign for a hospital meant infected nearby. A sign for a school meant potential barricades. A sign for a gas station meant either salvation or an ambush. And you couldn't tell which until you were close enough that the distinction might not matter. I met Darren Foles on day 8, outside a Dollar General in Greenfield, Indiana. He was sitting on the curb, eating peanut butter from a jar with his fingers. Mid-40s, heavy, wearing a FedEx polo shirt and khaki shorts. He flagged me down, and I stopped. because on day 8, I was still the person who stopped. He told me he'd been driving his route when the FedEx hub in Indianapolis went dark, and his supervisor stopped answering the phone, and then 2 of the packages in the back of his truck had started moving. He'd abandoned the truck and walked for 2 days. His feet were blistered and his knee was swollen, and he asked if I had room. I did. The bus was designed for 1, but there was floor space, and I had a sleeping bag I wasn't using. He climbed in and we headed east, toward Ohio, because he had a brother in Columbus and I didn't have a better destination. 3 days we traveled together. 3 days during which the world finished tipping. The radio stations dropped one by one, like candles in a wind. The emergency broadcast system issued contradictory instructions. Shelter in place, then evacuate, then shelter in place again, then silence. We passed through towns that were empty and towns that were burning, and one town, somewhere east of Richmond, Indiana, where every building had been spray-painted with a large red X, and we didn't stop to find out what that meant. Darren was good company. He talked about his brother, about his ex-wife, about a fishing trip he'd taken to Lake Cumberland that he called the best 4 days of his life. He didn't talk about the packages in his truck. I didn't ask. We shared food. We split driving shifts so I could sleep. For 3 days, the bus was what I'd built it to be, a home with room for another person. Then day 11. Route 35, east of Xenia. The noise under the rear axle. Darren stepping out. The figures in the tree line. And my decision, which I've already told you about and won't describe again because describing it again would make it sound like something I've processed, and I haven't. I drove east until I hit a road I couldn't pass, and then I turned north, and I didn't speak to another person for 43 days. Those 43 days were when I learned what the bus actually was. Not a home, not a vehicle, a parameter. It defined the outer boundary of my existence, what I could carry, how far I could go, how long I could last, how much of the world I could interact with before I had to close the door and move. I developed routines that were mechanical in both senses. Every morning I checked tire pressure, oil level, coolant, belt tension, and battery voltage. Every 3rd day I inspected the undercarriage for damage. Every fuel stop I calculated remaining range and updated a notebook I kept in the glove box. Date, odometer reading, fuel level, estimated miles to next probable resupply. That notebook became a kind of scripture. It was the only document that told the truth about where I was and how long I could continue to be there. I moved north through Ohio, skirting the cities. Columbus was a pyre. You could see the smoke column from 30 miles out, and at night the glow on the clouds looked like a second sunset that wouldn't end. I gave it a wide berth, taking county roads through Morrow and Knox counties, where the infected were sparse, and the living were either gone or holed up in farmhouses with the lights off. I scavenged when I had to. The technique I developed was simple and born from transport logistics. I never entered a building I couldn't see through from the outside. Glass-fronted stores were acceptable. Windowless structures were not. I carried a crowbar, not for fighting, but for prying open doors that I could then immediately assess from the threshold. If I heard anything inside, I left. If I smelled anything wrong, and you learn what wrong smells like, it's not decay, it's something sharper, something metabolic. I left. I took only what I could carry in 2 trips, and I never turned off the bus engine while scavenging. That meant burning diesel while I was inside a store, which was expensive by any calculation. But it meant the bus was always ready, always running, always capable of being the thing that saved me if the building became the thing that killed me. Fuel was the axis around which everything rotated. By week 4, gas stations were either empty, occupied by people who would kill you for what was left in the underground tanks, or still untouched, but in locations so remote that reaching them cost nearly as much fuel as you'd gain. I started targeting non-obvious sources. Construction equipment left at road projects, farm tanks behind agricultural properties, parked semi-trucks whose saddle tanks held 20, 30, sometimes 50 gallons of diesel that nobody had thought to siphon because nobody else was thinking in diesel. I built a hand pump from parts I found in a hardware store in Bucyrus, Ohio. Rubber hose, a brass check valve, a squeeze bulb from a marine supply shelf. It was slow. It took 15 minutes to transfer 10 gallons. But it worked, and it meant I could extract fuel from any tank with an accessible opening. And that capability kept me alive through June, when everything else was drying up. The bus changed as the months passed, not just through wear, though the wear was constant and accumulating, but through adaptation. I welded steel plates over the lower windows using a portable arc welder I found in a machine shop outside Mansfield. The upper windows I left clear for visibility, but reinforced with wire mesh bolted from the inside. I removed the rear emergency door entirely and replaced it with a steel panel, because that door was a vulnerability. It could be pushed inward, and I'd seen what happened to vehicles whose doors failed at the wrong moment. I mounted a second battery and wired it to a small solar panel I strapped to the roof, which gave me independent 12-volt power for lights and the radio without drawing on the engine battery. Every modification was a response to something that had almost gone wrong. The steel plates came after a night in Ashland County when 3 infected pressed against the side of the bus for 4 hours, testing every seam, and I lay in the back listening to their hands on the aluminum skin and understanding that the only thing between us was a 1/4 inch of metal designed to be light rather than strong. The wire mesh came after a rock thrown by a living person, not infected, just desperate, shattered a window outside Worcester. The solar panel came after a week when I couldn't find fuel and had to choose between running the engine for heat and running it for escape distance, and chose escape distance, and spent 3 nights in temperatures that made the water in my storage tank begin to freeze. By midsummer, I'd established a pattern that was less travel than circulation. I moved through a roughly elliptical route across north-central Ohio and into the fringes of Pennsylvania, following a sequence of resupply points I'd mapped and revisited. This wasn't exploration, it was grazing, moving through a territory slowly enough to extract what it offered without exhausting it, then moving on before the infected density or human hostility in any one area made staying untenable. I avoided other survivors not out of misanthropy, but out of arithmetic. Every interaction was a variable I couldn't control, and the bus was a system that functioned precisely because I controlled all its variables. Darren's face in the mirror had taught me what happened when you let someone else's timeline intersect with yours. I told myself that lesson was about speed and threat assessment. It was actually about guilt, and how guilt makes you build walls out of logic so you don't have to feel the thing that's behind them. Day 97 is when Noor appeared. I use the word appeared deliberately because that's how it felt. Not an encounter, but a materialization, as if the landscape generated her specifically to confront the system I'd built. I was parked in a rest area off Route 6 in northwest Pennsylvania. It was early August, brutally hot, and I'd stopped to let the engine cool because the temperature gauge had been creeping into the yellow for 2 days, and I suspected the thermostat was beginning to stick. I was under the bus checking the coolant hose connections when I heard footsteps on the pavement. Measured, deliberate, not the arrhythmic gait of an infected. I rolled out and stood up, and she was there, maybe 20 feet away, standing in the sun like she'd been waiting. She was young, 19, I'd learn later, though she looked both older and younger than that simultaneously. Thin in a way that was recent, her frame suggesting a body that had been well fed until not long ago. She wore a backpack that was too large for her, and men's hiking boots that were too large for her, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up that was too large for her. And the cumulative effect was of a person wearing someone else's survival kit. She had dark skin, dark eyes, and hair cut very short and unevenly, as if she'd done it herself with inadequate tools. She was holding a map, a physical paper road map, the kind gas stations used to sell, and she looked at me with an expression that contained no fear and no appeal. It was evaluative. She was deciding whether I was useful. "Your engine's running hot," she said. Those were her first words to me. Not "help me," not "are you friendly," not any of the things you'd expect from a lone teenager in an empty rest area 3 months into the end of the world. She pointed at the front of the bus, where a faint wisp of steam was curling from the hood seam. "You've got a coolant leak, or your thermostat's shot. If it's the thermostat, you can run without it. Engine will run cold, but it won't overheat. If it's the leak, you need to find it before you lose enough fluid to seize." I didn't say anything for a moment. I'd been alone for 86 days. My voice, when I found it, was rougher than I expected. "I know," I said. "I was checking the hoses." "Lower hose?" "Lower and upper, both connections." She nodded. "Check the water pump weep hole. DT466, right? They weep before they fail. Little hole on the underside of the pump housing. If it's wet, you've got maybe a week before it goes completely." She said this with a certainty that made me reassess everything about her. This was not a teenager who had stumbled onto mechanical knowledge. This was someone who'd been taught, and taught well, and recently enough that the knowledge was still organized. Her name was Noor Hassan. Her father had owned an auto repair shop in Erie, Pennsylvania, specializing in diesel trucks and buses. She'd worked in the shop since she was 12, not playing at it, working. Brake jobs, oil changes, injector replacements, the full scope of diesel maintenance, performed alongside a man who believed his daughter should be able to keep any engine running, under any circumstances. Her father was dead. Her mother was dead. The shop was gone. She didn't tell me these things immediately. They came out over days, in fragments, delivered without sentiment, the way you'd read items from an inventory list. This is what I had. This is what I lost. Here is what remains. I didn't invite her onto the bus. What happened was more structural than that. She diagnosed the coolant issue. It was the water pump, exactly as she'd predicted, weeping from the housing, and told me where to find a replacement. There was a bus depot in Corey, 16 miles south, where the school district had maintained its fleet. If the depot hadn't been cleaned out, there'd be parts. She knew this because she'd already been there, 2 weeks prior, scavenging for alternator components for a pickup truck that had subsequently been stolen from her while she slept. She had mechanical knowledge, local intelligence, and no vehicle. I had a vehicle with a failing water pump and no replacement parts. The arrangement was implicit before either of us spoke it aloud. We drove to Corey together. The depot was intact. A cinder block maintenance garage behind the school bus lot. 11 buses parked in rows, most with flat tires and dead batteries, but all with harvestable parts. Noor moved through that garage like she owned it. She found the water pump on a shelf in the back, still in its box, along with gaskets, a belt tensioner, and a set of injector O-rings she insisted I take because, she said, the O-rings would go next, and she didn't want to have to find another depot when they did. We spent 3 hours replacing the pump. She did most of the work. Her hands were smaller and reached places mine couldn't. And she had a technique for feeling bolt tension that was almost musical. She'd tighten until the wrench produced a specific resistance she could apparently sense through her fingers. I handed her tools and held the light and felt, for the first time since Darren, the strange compression that happens when you share a task with someone who understands the task as well as you do. It doesn't feel like help. It feels like a conversation conducted through the work itself. She stayed. I need to be precise about how that happened because it wasn't a decision. It was an accretion. She rode with me from Corey to a fuel point I knew about outside Titusville. Then she was still there when we stopped for the night. I offered the bed. She declined and slept on the floor between the storage racks, her backpack under her head. In the morning, she made a suggestion about our route that was better than the route I'd planned, because she knew the road conditions south of Meadville, and I didn't. Each day she was still there, and each day there was a reason she was still there that was specific and practical. And by the time a week had passed, the question of whether she was staying had been answered without ever being asked. I want to be careful about how I describe what Noor was to me, because the easy narratives are all wrong. She wasn't a surrogate daughter. I was 36, not 60, and she didn't need a father. She'd had one, and he'd done the job, and what she carried from him was complete. She wasn't a partner in any romantic sense. The thought never arose and wouldn't have been appropriate, and I want to state that plainly. What she was, most accurately, was a colleague. We shared a professional framework. We both understood diesel systems, route logistics, mechanical triage. We spoke the same technical language. And in a world where every other shared language had collapsed, civic, social, cultural, institutional, having even one domain of mutual fluency felt like finding breathable air in a room that was filling with smoke. But she changed the bus. Not physically, though she did that too, improving the electrical system, fabricating a better exhaust ventilation setup for the stove, rigging a compression brake switch that let me engine brake on steep grades without riding the service brakes. She changed what the bus was for. When I was alone, the bus was a life support system optimized for a single organism. Every calculation served my survival. Every modification protected me. When Noor was there, the calculations doubled, and the modifications served a shared architecture. And for the first time, I had to think about the bus not as my perimeter, but as our platform. That shift sounds small. It was seismic. It meant I couldn't make unilateral decisions about route, speed, fuel allocation, or risk without considering their effect on someone else. And it meant that when things went wrong, when the road was blocked, when the fuel ran dry, when the infected appeared in numbers I hadn't anticipated, I couldn't simply react from self-preservation. I had to react from something more complicated. Something that included the weight of another person's existence in my calculations. The summer burned on. August into September, the days shortening, the nights getting teeth. We moved through western Pennsylvania and into the fingertip of West Virginia and back north, always circulating, never settling. The bus rolling through a landscape that was both emptier and more dangerous each week. The infected were changing. Not in the way the early rumors suggested. They weren't getting smarter or organizing. They were getting slower. And at first I thought that was good. It wasn't. Slower meant they were lasting longer. The fast ones had burned through whatever metabolic fuel drove them and dropped within weeks. The slow ones were conserving. They stood in fields like scarecrows. They gathered in parking lots and didn't move until something moved near them. And then they moved all at once. And the collective effect was worse than the fast ones because you couldn't hear them coming. A fast infected announced itself. A slow one was just a shape you mistook for a shadow, until it wasn't. The human geography was changing too. By September, the initial chaos had resolved into territories. Some were organized, towns that had barricaded, farms that had armed up, a stretch of the Allegheny River where someone had established a checkpoint system using boats. Some were predatory. Groups that had decided extraction was more efficient than production and patrolled the roads looking for exactly what I was. A slow, heavy, fuel-laden vehicle carrying supplies. I was ambushed twice. The first time, outside Punxsutawney, someone had felled a tree across a 2-lane road and was waiting in the ditch. I saw the setup from 200 yards, because I'd spent 20 years reading roads for hazards, and a freshly felled tree across a clear-cut lane is not a natural event. I reversed, slowly, the bus groaning in complaint, the mirrors barely adequate for the task, and took a side road that cost me 4 miles, but not my life. The second time was worse. South of Brookville, a pickup truck pulled out of a side road behind me and followed for 6 miles. I couldn't outrun it. The bus topped out at 55 on flat road and struggled on any grade. But the bus had mass, and mass has its own authority. When the truck pulled alongside and the passenger pointed a rifle at my window, I swerved into them. Not to hit them, to demonstrate that I could. 19,000 pounds of steel against 4,000 pounds of pickup. The physics were not ambiguous. They dropped back. They followed for another mile. Then they turned off, and I drove until dark with my hands shaking on the wheel, and Noor sitting in the passenger seat with a tire iron across her knees, and neither of us saying a word. October brought cold and a new problem. The bus was not insulated for winter. I'd built it for 3-season living, and the walls were single-layer aluminum with no thermal barrier. On cold nights, the interior temperature tracked the exterior within a few hours of shutting the engine off, and running the engine all night for heat would burn fuel I couldn't afford. We addressed this in stages. Noor found rigid foam insulation at a building supply store in Clarion, and we cut it to fit the walls and ceiling, holding it in place with spray adhesive and duct tape. We hung a heavy curtain, a moving blanket, across the bus behind the cab to create a smaller space that our body heat could warm. I fabricated a simple diesel heater from a truck auxiliary unit we pulled from a wrecked Freightliner, and Noor plumbed it into the fuel system with a dedicated shutoff valve. It was loud, and it smelled, and it consumed a gallon every 10 hours. But it kept the interior above freezing on nights when the outside dropped to single digits. And that was the difference between habitable and not. But the cold changed more than the temperature. It changed the road. Frost heaves cracked asphalt that was already damaged from months without maintenance. Bridge decks iced over and stayed iced because no one was salting them. The bus, with its high center of gravity and worn tires, became treacherous on any surface that wasn't dry and flat. I slowed down. We all slowed down. Every vehicle still moving slowed down, and the slower you moved, the more vulnerable you were to the things that required speed to escape. The math was compressing. It had been compressing since the beginning, but now I could see the convergence point. The day when the bus would stop being an advantage and become a liability. When its weight and fuel demands and mechanical fragility would make it slower and more costly than walking. Day 141. I remember the exact day because I'd started marking the notebook with small events to give the calendar texture. And day 141 was marked with 2 words: Carver's Creek. We'd come south again, into the western edge of Maryland, following a route I'd plotted through the Allegheny Plateau, where the roads were lightly traveled and the infected density was low. Noor had identified a fuel source, a state highway department depot outside Oakland that should have diesel in its maintenance tanks, and we were maybe 8 miles out when we came around a bend and found a bridge over Carver's Creek that had partially collapsed. Not enough to be impassable for a car, but enough. The right lane had dropped about 18 inches, creating a step in the road surface that the bus could not navigate without high centering on the lip. The left lane was intact but narrow, maybe 9 feet, and the bus was 8 feet wide with the mirrors folded. I could try it. If the remaining structure held, I'd make it across. If it didn't, the bus would go into the creek, which was 12 feet below and running fast with autumn rain. Noor got out and walked the bridge. She knelt and looked at the underside where the support beam had buckled. She came back and said, "It'll hold. The failure's in the right stringer. The left stringer's intact and it's rated for 40 tons. You're at 9.5. I trusted her assessment because she'd been right about every structural evaluation she'd made. I drove across. The bridge groaned. The left lane sagged by an inch, maybe two, under the bus's weight. We made it. But on the other side I stopped and sat for a while. And what I felt wasn't relief. It was recognition. We'd just bet everything on a margin that was barely positive. And the margins were going to keep getting thinner. The fuel depot was intact. We filled everything. Main tank, both auxiliaries, every portable container we had. 206 gallons total. I did the math in the notebook. At our current consumption rate, that was 28 days of movement, or 41 days if we limited driving to every other day. 41 days would take us to late December. After that, we'd need another source, and sources were getting harder to find because everyone who was still alive and still moving was looking for the same thing. It was Noor who first heard the broadcast. Mid-November, a night cold enough that our breath made clouds inside the bus, even with the heater running. She'd been scanning the AM band on the hand crank radio, which she did most nights as a kind of meditation. Slowly turning the dial, listening to the static. Occasionally catching a fragment of something that might be a voice or might be atmospheric noise. That night she caught something clear. A man's voice, calm, repeating a message on a loop. Garrett County Emergency Community, located at the Deep Creek Lake Recreation Area. Sustainable food production. Medical capability. All survivors welcome. Approach from Route 219 South. Broadcast repeats every 4 hours. We listened to it 3 times. The voice didn't waver. The message didn't change. It sounded institutional, not a lone person with a radio, but an organized group with a purpose and a protocol. Deep Creek Lake was maybe 40 miles south of our position. 2 hours of driving on roads we'd already mapped. It was accessible, it was close, and it was offering the one thing neither the bus nor our skill set could provide: permanence. I didn't want to go. I need to be honest about that. The bus was my architecture. It was the system I'd built and refined and understood completely, and every mile I'd driven in it had confirmed its logic. Keep moving, stay small, control the variables. A settlement was the opposite of everything the bus represented. It was fixed, it was large, it was full of variables I couldn't control. Other people's decisions, other people's mistakes, other people's needs pressing against the finite capacity of whatever they'd built. I'd seen what happened to fixed positions. I'd driven past the evidence for months. Towns that had barricaded and then starved. Farms that had armed up and then been overrun. Churches that had opened their doors and then couldn't close them again. Permanence in this world was a form of faith, and I'd stopped having faith on day 11. But Noor wanted to go. Not out of hope. Noor was not a hopeful person, not in any soft or sentimental sense. She wanted to go because she'd done the math too, and her math was less forgiving than mine. She showed me the notebook. She'd been keeping her own log, parallel to mine, tracking not just fuel and mileage, but tire wear, brake pad thickness, suspension compression, and engine oil analysis. She'd been checking the oil color and consistency against a degradation chart she'd memorized from her father's shop. Her conclusion was quantitative and blunt. The bus had approximately 60 days of reliable mechanical life remaining. The tires were at minimum tread depth. The brake rotors were scored. The front suspension was developing a wobble that suggested a failing ball joint. and the engine, despite our maintenance, was consuming oil at a rate that indicated ring wear advancing toward the point where compression loss would begin affecting power and fuel efficiency. We could maintain it. We could nurse it. But the curve was pointing down, and at some point on that curve, the bus would stop being a vehicle and start being a steel box sitting on the side of a road. "You built this to move," she said. "It's not going to move forever. So you need to decide what happens when it stops." That conversation lasted 3 hours. It was the longest conversation we'd had. Most of our communication was efficient to the point of being telegraphic. Road conditions, fuel levels, mechanical status, weather assessment, threat evaluation. But that night, we talked about things that weren't mechanical. She told me about her father, not the skills he'd taught her, but the person he'd been. A man who'd come from Karachi with a mechanical engineering degree that wasn't recognized in the United States and had rebuilt his expertise from the ground up, literally, starting as an oil change technician and ending as the most respected diesel mechanic in Erie County. She told me he'd built the shop to be a place of permanence in a life that had been defined by displacement, and that when the outbreak took him, the shop had lasted exactly 6 hours longer than he did. She told me this without crying. She told me this with the precision of someone presenting a case study. And then she asked about Darren. She'd never asked before. She'd seen his name in my notebook, day 11, Route 35, and then a gap of 43 days before the next entry, and she'd inferred enough to not ask. But now she asked, and I told her. And when I was done, she said something that I've carried every day since. She said, "You didn't leave him because you were afraid. You left him because the bus could leave. If you'd been on foot, you would have stayed and fought, or stayed and died. The bus made the decision possible. That's not a moral failure. That's a design consequence." I don't know if she was right. I don't know if framing it that way was generous or accurate, or both. But I know that hearing it said aloud, by someone who understood systems and design consequences the way she did, changed something in the architecture of how I carried it. The guilt didn't leave. It shifted. It went from being a wall I pressed against every morning to being a load I carried in a known location, distributed across a structure I could at least describe. And that night, lying in the dark listening to the diesel heater tick and the wind press against the foam insulation we'd taped to the walls, I made a decision that wasn't about fuel or miles or mechanical tolerances. I decided to drive to Deep Creek Lake. Not because I believed the broadcast, not because I thought permanence was possible. Because Noor had asked, and because refusing to go would mean the bus had become the thing I'd built it to escape, a fixed point disguised as freedom. We left at dawn. The road south was worse than I'd expected. Route 219 had been a decent 2-lane highway before the outbreak, but 5 months of freeze-thaw cycles and zero maintenance had opened cracks into potholes and potholes into craters. I drove at 15 miles an hour, picking a line through the damage like threading a needle with a school bus. Noor sat in the passenger seat, watching the right side while I watched the left, and we called out hazards in the clipped shorthand we'd developed. Hole right, debris center, soft shoulder left. It took us 4 hours to cover 31 miles. The last 9 miles were on a county road that wound through forest so thick the canopy closed overhead, and in the dim green light beneath those trees, I saw infected for the first time in weeks. They were standing among the trunks, motionless, their skin the color of the bark around them. They didn't react to the bus. They'd gone dormant, the cold weather state that the slow ones entered when temperatures dropped below a certain point. They were alive, technically. They'd reanimate when it warmed. But for now they were statues, and driving past them was like driving through a garden of warnings about what spring would bring. We reached the lake at midday. The recreation area was on the western shore, a complex of park buildings and campground facilities that had been transformed into something I didn't have a word for at the time. It wasn't a fortress. It wasn't a town. It was a working system. I could see that immediately because I recognized the logic. The same logic I applied to the bus, but at a scale I hadn't imagined civilians could achieve. The perimeter was a combination of felled trees and earth berms, not high enough to stop a determined assault, but sufficient to channel approach into controlled access points. Inside the perimeter, the park buildings had been repurposed. One was clearly a commissary. Another had been converted to a medical station based on the red crosses painted on its walls. A third had smoke rising from a chimney in a pattern that suggested a wood-fired cooking operation running on a schedule. There were garden plots, even in November. Cold frames made from old windows. Rows of what looked like winter greens under plastic sheeting. There were people. Not many. Maybe 60 that I could see. They moved with purpose, not panic. No one was standing guard with visible weapons, though I was certain guards existed somewhere I couldn't see. The whole thing radiated a competence that I found simultaneously reassuring and threatening. Because competence implied leadership, and leadership implied hierarchy. And hierarchy implied that the bus and its occupants would be incorporated into someone else's system. We were met at the access point by a woman named Catherine Dow, who introduced herself as the community's logistics coordinator. She was perhaps 50, Vietnamese American, wearing a fleece vest and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she carried a clipboard. An actual clipboard with actual paper, which struck me as the most civilized object I'd seen in 5 months. She asked how many we were, what skills we had, what supplies we carried, and whether either of us was injured or ill. Her questions were efficient, and her demeanor was welcoming without being warm, which I appreciated because warmth from strangers made me suspicious and efficiency made me comfortable. She explained the community's structure. Decisions were made by a council of 7, elected every 60 days. Resources were pooled and distributed according to need and contribution. Newcomers were given a probationary period of 2 weeks, during which they could leave freely but could not participate in council votes. It was, she said, imperfect and evolving, and better than anything else they'd tried. I parked the bus inside the perimeter, in a campground space between 2 RVs that had been there since before the outbreak. I turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and enormous. For 151 days, the bus had been either running or about to run, and the cessation of that readiness felt like setting down a weight I'd forgotten I was holding. Noor got out and walked toward the commissary without looking back. And I understood that she'd already made her decision, that she'd made it before we'd left, that driving here had been her way of letting me arrive at the same conclusion on my own timeline. I didn't make my decision that day. I didn't make it that week. I made it in pieces over the course of December, as I learned what the Deep Creek community was and what it wasn't. It was functional. Catherine hadn't oversold that. They had food production, limited, calorie deficient by any pre-war standard, but real and renewable. They had medical capability, a retired veterinarian and a former Army combat medic who between them could handle most injuries and basic illnesses. They had shelter, water, heat, and a governance structure that distributed authority well enough to prevent the autocratic collapse I'd seen hinted at in every other group. What they didn't have was mobility. They had 4 working vehicles, 2 pickup trucks, an SUV, and a minivan, and maybe 300 gallons of gasoline between them, and no reliable way to get more. Their supply runs were getting shorter and more dangerous as the accessible radius contracted. They were, in a word, fixed. And being fixed meant that every resource they consumed was a resource that didn't regenerate, and every threat that approached would have to be met rather than avoided. The bus could change that equation. Not permanently, not dramatically, but meaningfully. The bus had range. It had cargo capacity. I could strip the living quarters and carry 2,000 pounds of supplies. It had diesel capability, which meant access to fuel sources the gasoline vehicles couldn't use. And it had me, a person who'd spent 20 years thinking about transportation logistics and 5 months applying that knowledge under conditions that no military exercise had ever simulated. What the community needed wasn't another pair of hands in the garden. It needed a supply line, a circulatory system, a way to reach beyond its fixed perimeter and bring back the things it couldn't produce. But making the bus a community asset meant surrendering the thing that had kept me alive. Not the bus itself, the principle it embodied. Mobility, autonomy, the ability to leave. If I committed the bus to supply runs for 60 people, I couldn't also keep it fueled and loaded and ready for the moment when I decided this place wasn't working and I needed to go. The bus couldn't serve two masters. It was either my escape vehicle or their lifeline, and the fuel it burned doing one was fuel it couldn't burn doing the other. This was not the dilemma I'd expected. I'd spent months preparing for the choice I thought was coming: to let someone in or keep them out, to share or to hoard, to open the door or keep it sealed. Every survival narrative I'd ever consumed had trained me for that binary. But the actual choice was different. It wasn't about admitting someone to my system. It was about dissolving my system into theirs. It was about looking at the bus, the thing I'd built with my hands, the thing that had carried me through 151 days, the thing that had defined the boundary between alive and dead, and deciding that its highest use was no longer as my shelter, but as their tool. The bus would still exist. I would still drive it. But it wouldn't be mine anymore. It would be theirs. And I would be, for the first time since before the divorce, part of something I couldn't leave without consequence. I made the decision on December 19th. I remember the date because it was the first day of a snowstorm that would last 3 days and drop 14 inches and make the question academic for a while. I was sitting in the bus, engine off, heater off, wrapped in a sleeping bag, looking at Noor's parallel notebook where she'd tracked the bus's mechanical decline. The numbers were clear. The bus had maybe 40 days of reliable operation left before something major failed. The ball joint, the rings, the brake system, any of the dozen components that were trending toward their limits. 40 days. If I used those 40 days driving in circles through an emptying landscape, I'd extract maybe 1,500 miles of survival that would end when the bus ended. And then I'd be on foot in January with nothing. If I used those 40 days making supply runs for Deep Creek, I'd extract maybe 800 miles of logistics that would feed 60 people through the winter. And when the bus finally stopped, I'd be standing inside a community that had food, shelter, medicine, and people who knew my name. I told Catherine the next morning. She didn't thank me. She asked me to present a logistics plan to the council that afternoon. I did. It was the most detailed operational brief I'd delivered since leaving the defense contractor. And the council, 7 people sitting on folding chairs in a park pavilion while snow piled up on the roof, listened with the specific attention of people who understood that what I was offering was not generosity, but infrastructure. They approved it unanimously. Noor, who'd been attending council meetings since the second week, voted yes from the gallery in a voice that carried no surprise. The supply runs began in January, after the snow melted enough to make the roads passable. I planned each one with the precision of a military resupply operation. Route, fuel budget, time window, contingency, abort criteria. Noor rode with me on the first 3. managing the mechanical monitoring while I drove and navigated. And on those runs, we recovered 1,200 pounds of canned food, 200 gallons of diesel, 80 pounds of medical supplies from a veterinary clinic, and 37 blankets from a linen warehouse that had been overlooked because it was set back from the main road behind an auto dealership. Each run consumed fuel and added miles to an engine that was slowly dying. And each run fed people who were slowly living. And the exchange rate between those two processes was the equation I managed every day. The bus made 11 runs total. On the 8th run, in early February, the ball joint failed on a frost-heaved section of Route 42. The bus lurched, the steering went loose, and I wrestled it to a stop on the shoulder with the right front wheel canted at an angle that made the vehicle undrivable. Noor and I replaced the ball joint with a used part we'd scavenged and carried as a spare, working in 12-degree weather with our fingers going numb inside gloves. And I realized while we worked that this was the last time. The replacement part was worn. It would hold for a while, but the suspension system around it was compromised, and the next failure wouldn't be a single joint, but a cascade. The bus was telling me, in the language I'd spent my life learning to read, that it was finished. Runs 9, 10, and 11 were careful. Short range, low speed, no unnecessary miles. I treated the bus the way you treat a dying patient who still has work to do. Gently, attentively, with full awareness that every demand you make is a withdrawal from an account that won't be replenished. On the 11th run, March 3rd, the engine developed a knock on the return leg that I recognized immediately. Rod bearing. The sound was distinctive, a deep, rhythmic hammering that accelerated with RPM and meant that somewhere inside the engine block, a bearing surface was failing, and metal was contacting metal without adequate lubrication. I babied it home. I kept the RPM under 1,500 and the speed under 20, and I talked to the engine the way my old NCO used to talk to overheated transmissions. Quietly, without panic, as if the machine could hear the steadiness in my voice and would respond in kind. It got us back. It got us through the access point and into the campground space, and I shut it off and sat there listening to the tick of cooling metal and knew that it would not start again. It didn't. The bus sat in that campground space through March and into April, its tires slowly softening, its diesel heater silent, its role in my life shifting from vehicle to monument. Noor and I stripped it methodically. The solar panel went to the medical station. The batteries went to the communications setup Catherine was building. The foam insulation was redistributed to poorly insulated cabins. The steel plates were removed and repurposed as reinforcement for the perimeter gates. The stove went to a family with 3 children who'd been cooking over an open fire. The water tank went to the garden operation. Piece by piece, the bus dissolved into the community the way a nutrient dissolves into a body, losing its form, retaining its function, becoming part of something larger than its original design. I kept the notebook, both notebooks, mine and Noor's parallel log, and I kept the sleeping bag, and the crowbar I'd carried for 8 months, and the hand pump I'd built from hardware store parts in Bucyrus, Ohio. These objects sit in the cabin I share now with no one, on a shelf I built from lumber salvaged from a demolished park restroom, and they are the only physical evidence that the bus existed as a thing separate from the community it now sustains in parts. 8 months, 242 days, roughly 11,000 miles, though the odometer stopped being accurate somewhere in October when the speedometer cable frayed and I never replaced it because speed had stopped mattering. Only distance and fuel and time mattered, and I tracked those in the notebook. I started in a campground in Clarksville, Tennessee, and I ended in a campground in Garrett County, Maryland. And the distance between those 2 points, as the crow flies, is maybe 400 miles.
The rest of the mileage was circulation.
The rest was me driving in patterns that felt like progress, but were actually holding patterns. Wide, slow orbits around a center I hadn't found yet, burning fuel to maintain the illusion that movement and survival were the same thing. They're not. I know that now. Movement is a strategy, not a state. It's a response to a specific condition, the condition of having somewhere better to be, or somewhere worse to leave. When those conditions are absent, movement becomes its own consumption, burning resources to sustain a direction that doesn't lead anywhere. I spent 5 months learning this, and I spent another 3 months unlearning the habits that the first 5 months had built. The hardest habit to break wasn't mechanical. It wasn't checking the tire pressure or monitoring the fuel gauge or listening for engine sounds that signaled failure. The hardest habit to break was the one I developed on day 11, when I watched Darren Foles shrink in the side mirror and press the accelerator instead of the brake. The habit of leaving. The habit of believing that the thing behind me was always more dangerous than the thing ahead. The habit of making the bus's capability my morality. If I can go, I should go, because going is what the bus does. And what the bus does is what keeps me alive. Noor broke that habit. Not by arguing against it, not by presenting a counter-philosophy, but by sitting next to me for 145 days and being a person whose presence made the bus more than a life support system. She made it a workspace, a partnership, a small, diesel-powered commons. And when the commons outgrew the bus, she walked into the larger commons without hesitation, because she'd understood something I hadn't. The bus was never the point. The bus was the delivery mechanism. What it delivered was its occupants, their skills, their knowledge, their willingness to be part of something, to a place where those things could be received. A vehicle is only as valuable as its destination, and a destination is only as valuable as the people who make it worth arriving at. I still walk out to the bus sometimes. It sits where I parked it, settling into the ground as the tires deflate and the frame oxidizes, and the aluminum skin develops a patina that makes it look like it's been there for decades rather than months. The seats are gone. The racks are gone. The bed platform is gone. It's a shell. But when I stand inside it and look through the windshield at the lake and the garden plots and the smoke rising from the commissary and the people moving between the buildings with purpose and complaint and the ordinary friction of shared existence, I can still feel the road under me. I can still feel the vibration of the DT-466 idling at 600 RPM, waiting for a destination. And I understand now that the vibration never stopped. It just transferred. It moved from the engine into the ground, from the bus into the community, from one man's lonely forward motion into the collective hum of people who decided that staying was not the opposite of moving, but its completion. Darren Foles is with me in that shell. He's with me every time I stand there, not as a ghost or a haunting, or the kind of cinematic guilt that resolves into wisdom. He's with me as an open question that I'll carry for the rest of my life. A question about the difference between what a machine makes possible and what a person should do with that possibility. I left him because the bus could leave. I stayed here because the bus couldn't leave anymore. And somewhere between those two facts is the territory where I actually live. Not in the bus, not in the community, but in the space between capability and obligation, between the road that goes forward and the person standing on the shoulder behind you, calling your name. I used to think survival meant maintaining the ability to move. Now I think survival means knowing when movement has done its work, and the thing it carried you toward is finally, irreversibly, more valuable than the road still unwinding ahead. The bus taught me to go. The people at the end of the road taught me that going was always in service of arriving. And arriving, true arriving, the kind where you stop the engine and don't calculate how much fuel you'd need to leave, is not the end of the journey. It's the moment the journey confesses what it was actually for.